Welcome to Season 2 of Time and Materials, a construction-only podcast powered by livecost.com, where we sit down with interesting people doing interesting things in construction. These construction experts kindly give us their time so that you can walk away with the tools to make better day-to-day decisions in your construction career. Hello, you're very welcome to another episode of the Time and Materials podcast. So this week, delighted to sit down with Keith Kelliher, who is an experienced arbitrator, adjudicator, mediator. Keith is also a quantity surveyor and has his finger on the pulse when it comes to what is happening with inflation and what do we think is going to happen with inflation and what are the impacts of inflation on our construction contracts. We also dive into a good bit around the post-mortem of COVID and have we actually seen the post-mortem yet? Can we have the post-mortem yet? Are we out of the woods essentially with COVID? And then in general, just, what is happening out in the marketplace? What do we think is going to happen out in the marketplace? So I hope you can sit back, enjoy, and get some value from my conversation with Keith Kelliher of Kelliher's and Associates. As COVID's played out, and you've had a bit of time maybe or have you had any time even to think about the impact? What do you feel has been the impact on your own business and the industry probably as a whole?
Yeah, I suppose we were very fortunate in that COVID didn't really impact our business, other than obviously the logistics of the business, moving home and working from home and things like that. But other than that, our business thankfully wasn't usually impacted because the necessity and requirement for people to chase down payment and get paid and have money flowing through the business didn't stop because of COVID. If anything, it increased. So what we actually found really was the real output of COVID was that people probably for the first time, for many people the first time ever, but for some people the first time since the crash, and maybe if they'd been let go or if it was a new business that had only started on the back of the upturn, let's say, of the Celtic Tiger crash, and that this was the first opportunity that they actually had forced upon them to stay at home and actually look at their business. So you kind of had that preface where you had people who were at home, so they had more time, and they were able to look at their business and who owes them money and different things like that. And then that was coupled with then people who had no income, and therefore they had to look at their books and say, who owes me money? And because I need that money to come in, because I'm now not earning any income, and any income that had been left to one side because they were just so busy chasing the day to day, they then had to go chasing that. So we found a marked increase in the number of people who were chasing kind of debts going back at 2 years, 3 years before COVID, which and that was a marked increase. So it wasn't that COVID itself was generating the disputes. It was the time off and that people were looking at their businesses around COVID. So we're only now seeing COVID claims really coming to a point where they're being decided upon. So any claims on the back of COVID, the shutdowns, the increased costs because, there was substantial increased costs of social distancing, companies having to supply double the number of vans that they have on the road because everyone was supposed to be traveling on their own. All of these types of things and the costs, the amount of sanitizers, all that stuff, the huge cost. So the claims, a lot of those jobs have only come to an end really within the last year, last 6 months to a year because they were delayed and whatever else. So a lot of the final accounts are now ongoing. And within those final accounts, we're seeing COVID claims, claims for the cost, claims for the shutdowns and different things like that. So it's only now really we're seeing that.
So can we hold the post-mortem on COVID yet? Are we there yet? Have we seen the full impact of COVID just yet?
Well, we to a large degree, I think we have. Well, COVID, unfortunately, when it landed, it did create part of what we now have of the perfect storm that lots of people have spoken about. We had COVID, we had an issue with timber and forestry in Ireland before COVID. So timber prices were already on the increase. You then had every factory in the world nearly shutting down, raw materials, everything. There was nothing flowing. You had the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. You had all of these things, and they all just landed at the same time. So can we blame COVID for everything? No, we can't. The timber was not related to COVID. yes, the shutdown of everything and a delay in the supply chain for everything, obviously, to start back up, and every country shouting for materials all at the same time. And we are a piece of salt on the table in the greater world of demanding raw materials just to come to Ireland. So there's lots of problems because of COVID, but there's lots of problems not related to COVID. And now we have the Ukraine war and all that goes with that. So the post-mortem, I suppose, when we look at COVID, is in reality comes down to one thing, and that is that the predominantly the building community paid for everything. Employers got away with everything, the government got away with everything, because of the way the contracts were structured. So there's very few people, other than ex gratia payments or people agreeing to give you a few quid with an acknowledgement that COVID happened and it did incur the contracting community a big cost. The contracting community have carried all the cost, because
definitely want to drill in. Yeah,
definitely
want to drill into that whole contract piece with you, and especially with the way inflation's going at the moment. What do you think then? What are the lessons do you think that could be learned from COVID in terms of contracts? So rephrase that question slightly. If I'm on the contractor side, given what we know now, what will happen on COVID, like what lessons can be learned?
The lessons, and unfortunately they're not being learned, but the simple lesson is that, like, things will happen and the contracts don't take account of them. So the contracts, to a degree, you shouldn't be signing up to a contract that doesn't have, at this moment in time, any allowance for a lockdown, any allowance for the next pandemic. Like, we have to live and learn. Like, I see contracts every day, and if I'm representing a client, we don't look to change anything. We look to protect the client. But none of the builders are coming back saying, I'm not signing that, or we need to amend that, to take account of a pandemic. So if you take the two main forms of contract that we have in Ireland for main contractors, we have the public works contract on one side for public jobs, and then we have the RAI standard form of contract. The RAI has a force majeure clause, and the force majeure clause allowed, and pretty much everybody, as far as I can see, granted an extension of time for the lockdowns. And that's not a problem. That's giving you the extra time of the lockdowns to finish the project so that you're not being penalized because you don't get the project delivered on time. But a force majeure event, in its very nature, is an event that the employer didn't stop you working. The event did. So in this case, the government stopped you going to work, but the employer never said to you, don't come to, I'm closing the site. They never said that. So the employer, because the employer didn't ask you to stop, the employer is not liable for any cost because they didn't instruct you to do anything. The event stopped you. Okay. So that's why people got time, but they didn't get any of the money. Okay. That's RAI. Okay. And there's no opportunity to get money. So as a contractor, you have to ask yourself, well, what if this happened again next week? What have we learned? So when we're signing the next project, COVID could no longer be classified as a force majeure event because it has happened. It's likely to happen again. So as it currently stands under the RAI contract, there's no avenue for a main contractor to even get the time if this happened again, because it's not going to be classified as a force majeure event. So we have to evolve and change wording and allow for such a thing happening. And we need to be careful that we don't talk about COVID-19. We need to talk about such an event happening again. Because with the public works contract, there is no force majeure contract. So the contractor wasn't even entitled to time, let alone money. But the government obviously weren't going to penalise, so people were given time through an ex gratia process. But the government have introduced a change to that contract specifically to take account of COVID-19. And you have to ask the question, well, what if it's COVID-20? What if it's COVID-21? They'll have to change the contract again because they've made the clause in the contract specific to COVID-19. So we need to learn that, like, this thing could happen again, pandemics, and we need to adjust the contracts to bring back in an element of fairness, an element of I suppose risk sharing. We're not saying that contractors shouldn't carry risk, but they shouldn't be carrying all the risk, and particularly like in the public works contracts where you have, who's best to carry the risk, the government or the contracting community on something like this? You'd have to say it had to lean towards the government, so they should be carrying some of the risk. and at the moment they're not. So we have to, as a contracting community, we have to say no, and we have to say this needs to change, and we have to make sure that on our jobs that we force a change, that we make sure we ask the question, what happens if COVID? What happens if we have a COVID tomorrow? Ask the question, what happens on this contract if we get COVID tomorrow? And that's the question that needs to be asked by everybody.
The government did step in there. I think pretty sure it was May or something. Michael McGrath released there was measures put in place by government, and it was on public contracts. What do you know about that? And I suppose the commentary around the time was builders are walking away from these projects, and will continue to walk away from these projects because of the inflation. What do you know about that, and what were your thoughts on that at the time?
Yeah, so I suppose we have to track this back on a timeline really quickly, but cost inflation started around 2019, really, was when costs started going up across the board. That continued through 2020. Like if you look at any of the indices on prices, so remember that COVID kicked in at what was it, March 20? Yeah, March 20 or thereabouts for us here. But if you look at tender price indexation, and that cost actually started increasing in the latter end of the last quarter of 2019, so pre-COVID. That then continued and exacerbated, obviously, with everything we've just spoke about: COVID shutdowns, Suez Canal issues, and now Ukraine and all that. So so when you just keep adding to that through 2020, 2021, now 2022. People started walking away from contracts because they weren't willing to sign up to fixed price contracts. They just couldn't. I remember a reinforcement company sending me a quote for a client, and we were doing a cost budget on something, and they literally had written on the email, "This price is fixed until the end of the day." That's the level we were getting to, till the end of the day. It used to be 90 days, and then if you agreed the cost, it would fix for the project. This is fixed to the end of the day. So you had contracts looking at this saying, so if I price something today, it's already probably, I'm losing money tomorrow. And this was across a range of products. So they started walking away. There was a number of contractors walked away from school projects and that. So the government were getting lobbied heavy that they needed to do something about this towards the latter end of 2021. And they came out in January 2022, and they outlined a plan where they would, on an ex gratia basis, so outside the contract, they would seek to repay, say, up to 70% of the increased costs on certain materials. They didn't give the detail on how any of this was going to work or anything like that, but they, unfortunately, for most contractors, they came out and said it would only backdate it to the 1st of January 2022. So all of those people who actually incurred the majority of the cost increase through 2019, 2021 have been left to basically float your own boat, which is the major disappointing thing, because they're the people who really hurt, because they had priced jobs in 2018, 19, delayed with COVID, finishing them in 21, 22, and suffering all the price increases. So they've been just left to their own devices, which is disappointing. So through the new system, the government, and going forward, they've amended the contracts, and they have brought what used to be a fixed price system under the Public Works contract of 30 months. They've brought that down to 24 months. So it's still a fixed price contract, but they've brought the rate of price increase in what we call hyperinflation, or, if a product increases in a period of time, which used to be kind of needing to go over 50% of a price increase in a particular month, they brought that down to 15%. So they've made certain changes, and then through an ex gratia outside the contract process, they've brought in an inflation kind of model, which is very statistics based and index based, and it's worked on a kind of highly complicated formula that unfortunately most contractors will not be able to understand. And that's just, there's videos, the OGP have sent out videos and workbooks and all these things to try and help people understand them, but you basically select 2 or 3 products, and that's all you're able to claim for. So product categories could be steel, timber on a project. You run the indices from a start point, finish point, particular month point. It's based all on percentages of materials and all this, and you end up getting 70%. It's, as I always say with these things, the contracting community will look at this and they'll kind of say, does this cover us? In no way does this cover us. Are we getting more than we used to get? Absolutely. Is it the end of this story? Absolutely not. I think this story has a long way to go in terms of rebalancing the risk. But it's a step in the right direction, has to be welcomed. But it's complicated. And I personally believe that if you're to take actual cost and compare it against the methodology that they've come up with, that the contractors will still be sustaining well in excess of the perceived 30% that they're supposed to be carrying on the public works.
Which means that, if there's substantial losses, obviously that we all know what that means. That's not good. We're already seeing a drop. Like the last couple of episodes we had, Sinead Liu from PwC was on. They're talking about ledger reports, and John McCartney come on from P&B Paribas, and he was talking about the activity has plummeted. Was one of the words that was thrown out there for Q2. Housing shortages out there. We still need to build houses. Do you think there's ever a chance that we might be able to get to a cost plus model?
It's popular in the UK. There's an NEC kind of form of contract over there, which is a lot fairer. It has a suite of different projects, different contracts, and one of them is a cost plus model, and it's quite a popular form of contract. I think in the private side, there's always that chance, because particularly with big multinationals who need, like, at the end of the day, you take an Intel or somebody, the build cost of anything is it's nothing in comparison to the money that they make once they get the chips rolling. So it's how they get to that point in the quickest possible time. So them getting into arguments, and certain companies getting into arguments with builders over cost increases, it's not a conversation they're going to have, because not getting the product made is going to cost the business far more. So in certain instances, it will be perfect, and probably will be used. But I don't think the government will ever move to that, because they're trying to protect the public purse, they're trying to protect us as taxpayers, and most private clients have X amount of gold. They don't have more, So the idea that they could enter into a project not knowing what the end cost is probably not going to happen. So you're trying to balance risk with who's best to carry it. And most private clients, particularly on the domestic front, like, if you want to build an extension or refurb or build a new house, if you've got 300,000, that's all you have. So entering into a fixed price contract for 300,000 is common sense.
What's happening there, Keith? What are you seeing there on in the domestic side? Like, obviously builders have obviously priced that job too a while ago, and now they're getting hit with these big hits. Let's call it big hits.
Yeah.
But what can happen there? What does the conversation look like between homeowner versus building contractor? Are the building contractors coming trying to have an open conversation? Like, what's happening there now at the moment?
There's look, it varies like everything. You will have lots of contractors burying their head in the sand, in terms of not aware of their rights, not aware of how they can change this tide. And then you have other contractors who are simply coming back and saying, look, we are not signing up to a fixed price contract here. We're happy to do the work, but you have to leave. And just for anyone listening, I suppose we'd always say the clause 36. So in the private contract, the main private contract that everybody uses, clause 36 is the clause in the RAI contract that allows for the contractor to claim for a price fluctuation. For the last 20 years, that clause has been struck out. Big red line put through it, not operating. Contractors who are in the know, I suppose, are now saying, we're only doing this job if you leave that clause active. And that clause allows a contractor to claim for these price increases from what's called a designated date, which is a date set at the time of tender, to every month as the job progresses. So that's what contractors should be doing, is saying clause 36 needs to stay active. And it's still a fixed price contract, it's still a lump sum. The client still has the protection of the contract, except for inflation. So inflation in materials. Now the clause relates to materials and labor. Obviously a contractor could say, or a client could say, look, I'm going to give you the material, but I'm striking out the fixed price on labor. Again, that's down to discussion. So contractors should be having that discussion, and any contractor that I would advise, I would be saying have that discussion. If I'm representing a client, I'm starting a tender where I can, saying it's a fixed price lump sum, and clause 36 is struck out. Why? Because that best protects me. So like any contract negotiation that goes on, whether you're buying bread, whether you're, it doesn't matter what the contract is. It takes two parties to tango, and a contractor has the right to negotiate just as much as the client. And they should be talking about it. And at the end of the day, what you don't want is a scenario where a builder goes bust because of this on your job and have to deal with that. And unfortunately, we've had a couple of occasions of that go on this year already. So, so there is a risk.
You mentioned there as well that a lot of the contractors, one of the lessons is that they're carrying a lot of the risk. And when you get to a main contractor versus main contractor, subcontractor relationship, I suppose, what can both parties do better, knowing where we are now? What can they do better to mitigate risk, I suppose, and protect themselves from a project going under, or worst case, a company going under?
Yeah. Look, it's an issue that we have. There's a broader issue. Our industry has become very adversarial. Like it's, and you use the word versus, and that's the correct word, unfortunately, to use in that context. We don't collaborate with each other. We don't operate as a team. When we talk about mental health and everything else, I always think there's a huge issue here in our industry, just on how we speak to each other as different steps in the ladder, and certainly there's a lot to be done in that space. And unfortunately, until we deal with that scenario, because it is an us against them, it is a versus B, you will always have the person higher up the chain passing as much risk as they can down the chain, and managing the people below them in a way that ends up in them making a profit. Remember that if you look at any of the top 20 contractors in this country, and you look at their profit margins, they're turning over hundreds of millions of euro, and they're making 2%, they're making 3%. So their margin is a very small margin, which is wrong in itself. And that's a problem in the industry. If at the top you're not making, a reasonable margin, then that's getting worse, and more pressure comes on to manage your supply chain, to pass risk to your supply chain, and to get your supply chain to pay for the problems. And that's what's going on in the industry at the moment. So everybody in the supply chain needs to be aware of that, and they need to read their contracts just as much as anyone else, and try and divert risk, get rid of stuff that they may not even know they're carrying, so that's what they have to do. And unfortunately, that's going to continue just because it is an A versus B, unfortunately. And until the day comes when we start working as teams, and it just is not going to change.
In that A versus B type situation, what percentage would you say of the disputes that you're seeing are down to retention or retention claims?
A huge amount, like there always was. There's, in terms of, I'd be guessing with percentages, I suppose, but it would certainly be 30%. It would be in that range. We'd have a lot of disputes where retention would come. It's not the main part of the dispute, but it is in there in the dispute as an issue. So to put a percentage on it, I don't know, but we would do it. Look, the problem with retention always is it's actually a relatively small amount of money. It generally is it's 10 grand, 50 grand, can be big. It's big for everyone in terms of their business, but like most of the time you're on jobs where it's like hundreds of thousands, whatever. But I'm on the retention, because remember, it's half. By the time it comes to me, really, it's half of what the retention was, because you got half of it back at substantial completion, and you're chasing this other half 12 months later. And at that stage, it's a small amount of money, and it's just so difficult to get it. It's just, the person you were dealing with might not even be in the business you're chasing.
Is there anything I can do? Like, if I'm the subcontractor, I'm dealing with a contractor. Listen, it's not that big an industry. We all know who's a good pair, who's not a good pair. So I've got a sense that retention's going to be an issue. Is there anything I can do in preparation for that?
Well, the main thing is to obviously actively chase it. Number one, right? Actively. Now, like a lot of people, like they don't chase it. They say that, like I've had people come to me and they say, I'm owed all these retentions. And I'll say, well, can you send me all the emails where you're chasing them? So, well, you haven't chased it. And as if the main contractor is just going to send it to them in the post someday, You have to actively chase it. And you also have to make sure that through that period, when from practical completion up to the day the retention is due, that if they're notifying you of any defects or anything like that, that you are being active in rectification of those defects. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you go looking for your retention and then they give you the list of contra charges for all of the repairs they had to carry out on your behalf. And they're able to give you the emails where they notified you of them at the time and you never responded. So prevent all that happening and keep your hands clean. And then if you can't get the money, our adjudication is there. Adjudication is the best way of getting the money. Most contractors won't fight an adjudication against retention unless they have actually an evidence to not pay you the retention. And so
is there a value there, Keith? Is there a value where that becomes unviable, where it's just not really not worth chasing?
Not with my business. Other businesses, yes. Like we will always work with anybody. And what we will find is we will look at the evidence that you have to give me. I look at that and let's say you're owed 10 grand. The reality is that if I instigate adjudication against somebody, they have a decision to make as to whether they're going to spend money fighting this thing. Now, if they fight it, I would say to a client, look, it's not going to be worth our while because of the risk of an adjudicator's bill and everything else. But it's worth, at least exploring. We certainly would never be a roadblock to somebody on retention. Like we will work with them, help them fill it, because it's a case of filling in at that stage. It's filling in a few forms. You're not getting into a big drama in terms of story, because the story's over. We're talking about retention. Generally, the value isn't in dispute. It's why you're not getting released that is the dispute, because there's contra charges or whatever else. So again, we look at everything on its merits, and we would advise of the risks. But there really isn't, a low end value. Yes, I suppose you drop below 10 grand, it really becomes very risky in terms of you not being successful. But outside of that, there's not a huge amount of avenues to get the money other than, I suppose, suing someone through a district court, which is the low value of our court system. But then a lot of that depends on what's in your contract. So you have to be careful.
What do you think the impact of inflation then will have on contracts? So we're only in the early part of this, really. So we're just starting to see some of the impacts of that. So as we said earlier on in the conversation, it's the next problem. What do you think the impact will be on the contracts then?
There's a simple impact on it, and that is just contracts won't happen in the first place because people will simply not afford to build. The end user, be it that your homeowner who's extending the one-off house up to multinationals on their fit outs, it comes to a point where this is just too expensive and we are better off just waiting. And so, we are going to go over a cliff of just the work will not be there. And that's in new work. In terms of existing work, unfortunately, if you've signed up to a contract on a fixed price basis, you need to finish that contract, or you go bust because you can't, or you walk away from a project and you run the risk of being sued, and all that goes with that. So, if you've an existing contract, the contract tells you what you can and can't do. There is no magic fairy dust or anything that anyone can sprinkle on your contract to make it any different. So this is why reading contracts and understanding contracts before you sign them is important. But I think the main impact will be work will just stop. It will slow down. We're already seeing it in the domestic game. It's too expensive to build. So if somebody was thinking of putting the extension on and a year ago it was 100 grand, it's now 200 grand. That's the reality. We've jumped that. Like, we're not talking about 110. We're talking substantial increases in cost. And there's also an element of a cyclical issue here. And I saw this on a job recently where, why are costs going up in certain areas? And one of the things that became evident is certain trades that we have in Ireland, they're predominantly now being done by non-Irish, traditional, let's say Irish, they're being done by immigrants. So, and statistically, most immigrants, which we need, and we need more of them, but they're probably renting. And this was said to me by a tiling contractor because I was having a conversation with him and his costs were increasing. And the reason they were increasing is because all of his staff are renting. So as the rent increases, they're coming to him and they need more money just to keep up with rent. So he's having to increase his tiling prices so that he can increase the money that he's paying his staff just so that they can rent. So it's all cyclical. We're like, one thing increases results in another thing, and there's just no end to that. Because then the tiling increases and then that goes into the main contractor increases. And the next tender that the main contractor does, he has to increase the tiling price. So the next homeowner's tiling is more expensive, or the developer has to increase the cost. And it's all just heading in the one direction. So how do we deal with that? That's the challenge for government, because if we do not bring the cost of living down, it's impacting everything. And in construction, we then have a cost of living issue, which impacts labor. And then we have the material pricing, and it's just getting out. It's just gone to a level that's, just out of control, absolutely out of control. Like, a lot of our products are twice the price today that they were 4 years ago. We don't even have to say 20 years ago. 4 years ago, you have products that are now more than twice the price that they were, and that's just, that's hard to even imagine.
Having a conversation recently with someone that knows this space well, and I suppose the thoughts that were out there was that the manufacturers have gone crazy this year, trying to catch up with essentially with manufacturing, and have over manufactured, and then you get a little dip in the market and suddenly you're oversupplied. And that's probably the positive, maybe the positive that we can look to and say, okay, well, if we're oversupplied and there's not enough, maybe that just settles that price down. So at least we won't still have that major increase on the material side, the labor side.
And there was storing of materials. Like, there's lots of talk of, like, that there's warehouses around Ireland with lots of plywood and lots of insulation, and that these things are being stored. You also, unfortunately, have an elephant in the room, which we also, people are nearly afraid to talk about. I'm certainly not, but the profiteering, the profiteering that goes on. Like, all you have to do is look at the profits that are being made by builders, merchants, more than they've ever made in the past. So you have to ask the question, how can that possibly be the case if you're saying you have to pass on all these costs? So everyone needs to get a little bit real here. Everybody needs to kind of, have a little bit of ownership, that if we allow this market to keep going the way it's going, and if it's purely been driven by profits, or even if any of it's been driven by profits, we're only damaging ourselves, and you can make profit today, but you're not going to make it next year because the work simply won't be there. So, there's that element that, and it is an elephant in the room because people are afraid to talk about it, but it needs to be spoken about. And, and it's evident in companies reporting profits. So, it's not something we're making up. So,
Keith, if I'm a contractor, subcontractor, and I'm worried whether any of my contracts, current contracts, future contracts, where could I find you to have a chat about that?
Yeah, all our adjudicator.ie or quantisurveyor.ie. You'll find us out fairly active on LinkedIn and Facebooks and all them wonderful places. Google Keith Kelliher, you generally find me fairly quickly. Happy to help anybody who has a question at any stage. We don't charge for phone calls.
Brilliant, Keith. And thank God you don't charge for podcasts as well, because otherwise we don't get a few bob at this stage. Keith, listen, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Not at all, Ciaran. Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Time and Materials is brought to you by LiveCost, the construction software fully designed to manage your construction financial forecasts. Visit livecost.com to take a product tour, or reach out to our team of construction cost experts to transform your project profits. Any links mentioned during this episode, including speaker profiles or any other resources, are available on the podcast show notes. Your feedback is also welcome. We would really appreciate if you could take a moment to leave us a review, or email your comments, guest suggestions to hello@timeandmaterials.com. Finally, if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm your host, Ciaran Brennan.